We generally stay up in our heads. We're very visually and auditorially oriented, busy cognitive experience going on, very externally oriented. And we do that to our own detriment, right? Because we're disembodied, we're completely exposed to all the distractive and traumatizing influences of the world. So this is all about reestablishing that home.
Dr. Fleet Maull, meditation pioneer, social entrepreneur, and founder of Heart Mind Institute, a former prisoner turned global advocate. He's catalyzed prison reform, develops trauma-informed neurosomatic meditation, and authored Radical Responsibility. Bridging science and wisdom, he empowers leaders to heal, awaken, and transform systems from the inside out. Dr. Fleet Maull.
Letting the big intensities flow through. How does that show up now in your neurosomatic mindfulness?
Even people who practice a lot, they're often blocked from the deeper states of flow because they can't relax. They haven't really done the emotional clearing work, and they haven't developed that internal neurophysiological architecture. You can't let go into those deeper states. And the reason is because...
Welcome back to The Boundless Body. So check this out. 63.5% of you who are regular listeners haven't subscribed yet to the show. So please take a moment. It would be really helpful to click subscribe. It's free of charge. It will really help us out. In turn, we'll help you out by bringing you better and better content. Along those lines, send us an email with your feedback, boundlessbodypod@gmail.com. Send us your feedback about how you think we can do better. Give us questions to address on the show, interviewees you'd like us to interview. It'd be super helpful. Okay. Let's be a community.
Dr. Fleet Maull, welcome to The Boundless Body.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be with you, Dr. Tierney.
All right. So we got lots to talk about today, including the prison project, prison work that you've been involved in for many, many years, as well as your neurosomatic mindfulness approach. I'm really excited to talk about network neuroscience and other things related to healing. So welcome. So here's your bio. I'm just going to read it out for our audience. Dr. Fleet Maull is an author, meditation teacher, mindset coach, and a social entrepreneur who works at the intersection of personal and social transformation. He's the CEO and founder of Heart Mind Institute, which offers online summits, courses, and coaching programs that integrate Western science with ancestral and contemplative wisdom. Dr. Maull also founded Prison Mindfulness Institute and National Prison Hospice Association, catalyzing two national movements. Based on his 50 plus years of study and practice of numerous meditation techniques from the world's contemplative traditions, Dr. Maull developed Neuro-Somatic Mindfulness, or NSM meditation, a deeply embodied neuroscience and trauma-informed approach to meditation that accelerates healing, transformation, and spiritual awakening. He has authored Radical Responsibility, How to Move Beyond Blame, Live Your Highest Purpose and Become an Unstoppable Force for Good. Sounds like a good one. Dharma in Hell, The Prison Writings of Fleet Maull, and The Resilient CEO, Neuroscience-Informed Mindfulness-Based Wellness and Resiliency for Corrections Professionals. So, if you could just bring us through a little bit of an autobiography, obviously you were in prison. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey and a little bit about your own suffering that got you inspired to help alleviate suffering in the world?
Yeah, I'll try to encapsulate that as best I can briefly. So I grew up in the Midwest. I'm a baby boomer, so I came of age in the 60s. The summer of 1966, I discovered LSD, marijuana, and Buddhism at the same time. I think the first Buddhist book I read was Zen and the Art of Archery by Herigel, who was a German man who had studied the Japanese archery tradition, or Kyudo, in Japan. And his whole process of working with his teacher, who was a master in that art, was kind of a deconstruction of his false self and his ego through that process. I really resonated with that. It kind of really created an awakening in me. And then I started reading a lot in Zen, D.T. What was available back then, mostly D.T. Suzuki and a few other things. And it was really even still, I don't think Suzuki Roshi had even arrived in the U.S. at that point, but when his first book came out, reading that and so forth. But that mixture of involvement with the counterculture and drug experimentation and an interest in Buddhism and contemplative spirituality in the mind just kind of that became an intertwined path for a long time, and that landed me, and I earned my way into a 14-year federal prison sabbatical, if you will, before I was able to untangle all that. Earlier to that, kind of setting that up, I sadly had alcoholism in my family growing up, but basically good middle-class family with good values, Roman Catholic family in the Midwest. My beloved mother suffered from episodic alcoholism. I had two mothers. One was this really beatific, artistic, really insightful, intelligent mother who was like my best friend. And then the other was this terrifying rageaholic, sometimes violent alcoholic rageaholic. And you never know which one was going to show up. Fortunately, it was the good mother was there most of the time, but once a week or once every other week, every now and then, twice a week, the other one would show up. And that created a lot of psychic splitting in me, as you can imagine. And I had an older brother and 3 younger sisters, so it impacted all of our lives in different ways. I think a lot of it zeroed in on me in a particular way. But so I arrived in adolescence with a big gaping hole in my gut. It felt like this black hole of abyss that I was trying to cover up and patch up and fill up with any experience I could. So really, I remember before the onset of that, my early childhood felt really magical to me. I felt really plugged into the world and sense of awe and magic. And that just kind of disappeared probably around the time of starting school. So maybe that's a normal developmental process. Maybe it had to do with starting school and kindergarten and a Roman Catholic church, or maybe it had to do with my mother's alcoholism or all the above. But things went from vivid and colorful and magical to just gray tones. And I was never accepting that. So I was always looking to recapture some sense of really being plugged in. You know, I lost my faith in the Roman Catholic tradition very early on. I just kind of never bought into it. I always felt like when I first read that book, Stranger in a Strange Land, I really resonated even with the title of the book, much less the whole book, because I really felt like somehow the stork dropped me into the wrong household or something. A good family, like, who are these people and what am I doing here, right? And so I kind of never bought into the theology of that tradition. But at the same time, I was an altar boy, and I appreciated the kind of mystical quality of the pre-Vatican II Catholic rituals, right? They kind of went Protestant after the Vatican II. The theology improved, but they dumped the mysticism, right? So mixed bag. But at any rate, I was looking for that sense of awe. You know, then with the counterculture, you know, drug, sex, and rock and roll, all of it, there was some quality of plugging back in with those experiences. But, you know, it's maybe some reality to some of it, kind of a mirage-like quality to other aspects of it. But if you got to the big hole and you got addictive propensity, so, you know, there's a lot of baggage that comes along with that. So, you know, I graduated from high school in 1968, classic kind of angry young man with this big gaping hole in my gut. And that was an incredibly tumultuous year in U.S. history for people that were around then. This was the year of the Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, the Kent State killings, and really just a tremendous social upheaval. And so, you know, I had become super alienated, culturally alienated, politically alienated, and I just went headlong into the counterculture at the time as I began my college years. And my college years were years of drugs and confusion and craziness and so forth. Eventually, to escape that, I left for South America. I had some idea that I would rediscover this magic down there. I don't even know where I got that idea, but I wanted to get to Peru. And it had nothing to do with the drugs. And so I started off traveling with a friend and went down through Mexico. And we had a lot of amazing experiences all through Mexico and Central America. And ended up buying a sailboat, lived on a sailboat for a year, which was very cleansing just to live off the ocean. We had no money. We just lived off what we could spearfish and living out in a sailboat with, you know, I owned a T-shirt and a pair of cutoffs and a mask and fins and a spear gun and lived like for a year on this sailboat in the Caribbean. We wanted to keep going, so eventually we found some people to buy that boat, some other travelers coming through and continued our journeys. And I finally did make it down to Peru, and it turned out it was an incredibly magical place. You know, you wake up in the morning, especially once I got out into the mountain areas and out into the Sacred Valley of the Incas and that area. You know, you'd wake up in the morning and it was as if you had consumed some substance, but you hadn't, right? The whole place just had this magical aura to it. And a lot of my journey in South America and in Peru and so forth had to do with a real fascination with indigenous culture and the archaeology, anthropology of those cultures and those lands. And in the background was the drugs had kind of somewhat faded in the background, but would come in and out, eventually deep into exploring plant medicines down there, primarily Wakama. Actually, all those years I was down there, I never did ayahuasca, which is that area is so known for these days, but it just didn't work out. Back then, there weren't any retreats. There weren't any guides. You headed off into the jungle on your own by yourself to find some ayahuasqueros to do it with. And I had friends that had, and I would have. It just somehow the timing never worked out. But I was deep into working with San Pedro or Wakama, which is a mescaline cactus, for many years. So, that was a whole long journey. I had been interested all along in the mind and contemplative spirituality and the meditation. And I was trying to meditate on my own, and I was working with some practices from Taoist manuals. And then I kind of zeroed in on the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. There were only 4 books that had been written at that time. It was the Evans One series. They're not considered great translations today. He kind of did it really through a Western Judeo-Christian lens, but nonetheless, he was a real pioneer who went to Tibet and had several Tibetan masters and did the early translations of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Lives of Milarepa and Life of Padmasambhava and others. So I had those books, and that was really all that had been published of that tradition at that point. So I was deep into studying those and living way up in the mountains in Peru. Eventually, I heard about the founding of Naropa, then Naropa Institute, now Naropa University, by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the Tibetan master, in 1974. And some travelers actually showed up at my home, which was in a very remote valley off the main Sacred Valley of the Incas. And you really had to trek to get there. But people would wander up there, and they brought a copy of Rolling Stone magazine from the fall of 1974 that had a huge feature story about that first summer session. So there were 2 sessions at Naropa Institute where they expected a few hundred people, and they got like 1,500 people each of 2 summer sessions. And Ram Dass was there teaching with Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. It was a huge scene. William Burroughs was there, and Buckminster Fuller, and the whole avant-garde was there. And, it was a whole lot of meditation was there. Yeah. A lot of the prominent meditation teachers later, like Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, they were all there. There were many, Krishna Das was there, and many, many different people. Bhagwan Das was there, anyway, it was quite a scene. And so I read about that, and the whole scene wasn't really pulled me in. I was pulled in I just saw Trungpa Rinpoche's name, and I just knew I had to go there. It was just like, I managed to get up there and decided I wanted to do this master's in contemplative psychotherapy, which was an integration of Buddhist and Western psychology and psychotherapy. And it was a very intensive kind of 3-year clinical program at a master's level. And so it took me a couple of years to get up there and do that. And I self-funded it through smuggling, which I was justifying. I'd got involved in small-scale smuggling, justifying that with all this us versus them, thinking about how hypocritical the world was and living outside of it with this outlaw mentality and all these internal justifications. And so did all that. So anyway, I went back and I ended up doing through that program, an incredible program, which a lot of which still informs my work today. Ended up becoming a very close student of Trungpa Rinpoche, but kept this hidden life secret of where I would disappear once or twice a year and do a smuggling run and continue to keep my problem. My marriage was falling apart because of the craziness of my life. My wife was from Peru, and she never quite assimilated the U.S. culture, and my life was pretty, so I kept my money at bay with those problems, and I knew all this had to end. There was a lot of cognitive dissonance around being involved in that and what I was involved in, and I was self-medicating around that. And I'd spent about half the year in retreats and traveling with my teacher and really deep into the work, and the other half the year being this crazy cocaine cowboy smuggling and self-medicating and, pretty wild life in many ways, and also addicted to the adventure of that. There was something about, when you're on a smuggling run, it's almost like probably similar to what some soldiers talk about when they have trouble adjusting from war because there's some kind of life and death intensity to warfare that's not there when you come back to ordinary life. And so there was something about that when you're involved in that smuggling that I think I was addicted to. Mm-hmm. And anyway, before I could untangle all that, I finally did decide to quit, but others continued and got busted and decided to invite me along. And eventually I knew I was going to be indicted, and I had the choice of either going on the run because I was being threatened with, 30 to life in prison. And so is this something I should just escape and, go to India or somewhere well, unfortunately, I didn't have any really financial resources at that time because just the way my whole kind of smuggling career ended, it didn't end with any money in the bank. And because I was never trying to get rich at it, I was just living outside the system, so to speak. And so anyway, the idea of going on the run wasn't very appealing to me, but the idea of going to prison for a long time wasn't appealing either. And I was trying to figure all that out. So I finally let my teacher know about all this that I kept secret from him. And he reflected on it for a while, and his recommendation was you need to stay and face it. He said, if you're on the run, it's going to be very difficult for you to continue your path or continue as a student. But even if you're in prison, you can continue to practice and we can continue to work together as teacher and student. It was kind of a relief in a sense, although I was terrified about going to prison and having nightmares every night about going to prison. But it's the first time I really took anybody's advice. Prior to that, if you wanted me to do something, just tell me to do the opposite, right? I was that kind of like that. I did turn myself in, and as it turned out, they never gave me bail. They set the whole thing up to try to really over-prosecute me in any way they could. So I turned myself in, and that was it. My whole life just dissolved. And my son and his mom went back to Peru. I went through the whole prosecution thing because they indicted me on this so-called kingpin statute of continuous criminal enterprise. And kind of the way that works is whoever the person they find that they want to prosecute that doesn't cooperate with the government, they become the kingpin, and then everybody else is willing to compete becomes the network. And right. So I wasn't refusing to testify because I was some kind of stand-up guy. I've been a Buddhist for many, many years. And the idea that, someone else is going to suffer, somebody else's family and children are going to suffer so that I don't suffer. I mean, I couldn't reconcile that in my mind or heart in any way. So I was never even inclined to become a cooperating witness in that way. So I was thoroughly prosecuted, and I ended up being convicted on 5 counts and originally sentenced to 30 years with a no parole sentence. At that time, there was parole in the federal system, but I received a no parole sentence. At that point, I just thought that meant I was going to serve all the time. Fortunately, I was sentenced before 1987 under what they call the old law, where there was still a lot of good time. So even with a no parole sentence, it was what they called statutory good time and then extra good time. And so on a long sentence like that, you got 10 days on statutory good time. And then if you kept a job while you're in prison, you earned another 5 days a month as you kept going. You didn't have to do a good job. You just had to keep a job. So I was earning that good time. And then if you get in trouble in prison, they take that away from you in chunks. It's not easy to stay out of trouble in prison. And if you get in trouble, they start taking away your good time. Fortunately, I was able to manage not losing any of that good time. And then on appeal, everyone appeals your conviction. So on appeal, they drop 1 count, which really probably should have given me a new trial, but it doesn't. It's just a matter. They charge you with conspiracy and this kingpin statute, which are really the same, but one carries much higher penalties, and it confuses the journey. And so later, the courts always make them drop the lesser one, which is really just a tactic. So that dropped my aggregate sentence from 30 to 25. And so by that time, I knew on the 30, I was going to serve 18 and a half. If I stayed out of trouble, it still felt like forever. And then once the appeal came through and my sentence was reduced to 25, then I knew I'd serve 14 and a half on the 25, on 25, which of course still felt like forever. I still had probably 11 and a half to do at that point, or 12 by that point when my appeal went through. That's just the world I found myself in. When I got convicted, I really hit a wall of absolute devastation, realizing what I'd done to my son. And I finally had to face all the incredible selfish decisions I've been making for so long, justifying it with whatever justifications I had. I was really just directly selfishly putting his life at risk and his mother's life at risk. And so now he was going to grow up without a dad. And I went through a real dark night of the soul experience around all that. And I just became radically dedicated to getting all the negativity out of my life and taking everything I'd received and doing something good with it and creating a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison or even his dad died in prison. Because I had no surety that I was going to survive that time. Prisons are very violent places. And plus, I was going to be there a long time. And I ended up doing my time at the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners, which is the maximum security federal prison hospital, with about 1,000 patients, about 600 medical and 400 psychiatric. And then there was a work cadre, they called it, a general population prisoners there to help run the place. And I was in that, about 300 of us. So I was seeing men younger than me and my own age and older dying all the time there in that prison, right? So I had no surety that I would survive my time. But I wanted to leave a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison or died in prison. So I became dedicated to doing that. I also realized that one of the things that really been missing from my Buddhist path was a focus on the ethical principles and the precepts, and that I've really been much more interested, like a lot of my generation, been more interested in awareness of the mind and the psychology and insights of liberation. And I realized I really needed to focus on that, so I became really dedicated to living the Buddhist precepts. I ended up taking monastic precepts and really trying to figure out I became an ordained monk, and I figured out what does it mean to be a monk in prison, because you can't wear robes, but what does it mean to have that internal discipline? So I really was practicing like my hair was on fire. I had incredible motivation. I was sleeping maximum 5 hours a night for years, 4 to 5 hours a night, probably for the first 10 years. I was just getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to practice. And I had a full-time job teaching school, which was very gratifying and an important part of my journey there. For 14 years, I was helping other prisoners learn to read or get their GED or study for correspondence college classes and so forth. Got very involved in my own recovery work from drugs and alcohol, and so I was very involved in the 12-step work there, and the outside volunteers that came in were a big part of my journey. We had some really amazing outside sponsors that came in. I started a meditation group in the chapel, and so I was leading that group for those 14 years. And then a really big part of my journey there, since this was maximum security medical center, this was the height of the AIDS epidemic, was just going into full swing when I got there. And so they were bringing all the AIDS patients from all the federal prisons there, the high security patients. There was a tremendous amount of fear, and in the prison population, it's a very divisive world. There's zero trust on both sides. And so, the prisoners thought that they're bringing all these patients there to expose us to AIDS and to see if we get AIDS. And there was all this fear. And they hadn't done any education around it yet. So they were keeping the AIDS patients locked back in a psychiatric ward for their own protection. And so I got very concerned about that. And I had access to those wards because I was working in a school and would go back there to put up posters about various programs. And a lot of guys from the psychiatric various wards, some of them could get out and they could come to the education program. And they also could come to the meditation group. And so I had a lot of relationships there. And so I got very concerned about them. And I was also involved in a project where we were showing movies in the lock wards for patients, as well as medical patients as well. So I would take this projector back there. They would let me bring it back there. They wouldn't let me go into that lock ward with the AIDS patients, but I would take it in. And being a smuggler, I was smuggling in magazines and other things, But I got very concerned about their plight and trying to figure out how I could help them. And so I started reaching out to the outside, and that way I got very in touch with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Stephen Andrea Levine and Bob Hall and others who were very involved in supporting the people with AIDS, and especially in California way back then.
Well, Stephen and Andrea Levine, I love their teachings. I ran into their teachings at a really young age when I was studying Ram Dass, and ran into some old lectures from Naropa Ram Dass lectures. And then Stephen and Andrea were very influential in my early years. I just loved I loved their way.
They're beautiful people. And Stephen did prison work very early on. He was teaching meditation in San Quentin on death row very early on. But he was very involved in life care. His book, Healing into Life and Death, and Who Dies are really seminal books. So they all became supporters. And with another prisoner, I ended up being able to start the first hospice program in a prison anywhere that we know of, anywhere in the world, in 1987. And we trained fellow prisoners, brought in outside people to train us to be hospice volunteers. And we were hospice volunteers, almost like surrogate family. We were there. We spent hours a day with our patients. We were doing all the psychosocial, spiritual care. We couldn't do direct medical care, although we bathed them and we couldn't do IVs or give meds or anything like that, but we did everything else. And, you get because they had nobody else. So once they, figured out whether they could trust you or not, they would just pull you in and you'd be like their brother, their father, their son, whatever the age relationship was. And it was very deep, close relationships. And that became a huge part of my life there. And I helped develop the program. We had a clinical meeting in the chapel every week with medical and chaplaincy staff and so forth. And I really designed and led the training program and recruited the outside people. And we eventually published some work around that and got published in peer-reviewed journals and hospice magazine hospice movement feature magazines. And based on that, I started National Prison Hospice Association to get that model out in the world. And Today, there's maybe 80 or 90 hospices in state and federal prisons as a result of that work. So I'm still involved. We're actually involved in kind of resuscitating National Prison and Hospice Association right now. It kind of got, it's a long story about how its funding collapsed right around the time I got out of prison, but we're resuscitating it now. But it's been an information hub all along, but we're refunding it and getting a new director involved, and we're involved in a movie that's being done about the history of the hospice movement. But anyway, that work was very rich part of my life there, and very transformational to be at the bedside of others and be able to place their needs ahead of your own, and really confront your own mortality by being, a lot of these men I work with were younger than I was. Some were my age, and there they were. And I had not been tested for age yet, and I had a very promiscuous early life, right? And I've been an IV drug user, and I clearly could have had AIDS. I finally did get tested and was relieved that I didn't have AIDS. But one of my patients they all stick with me. They're all really still living within me today. They're a very close relationship. But there was one man named Maull who initially was coming to the meditation group. He had an interest in meditation. He'd read Chogyam Trungpa's book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. As we kind of became friends, and he was fascinated through the chapel, was able to get them to order various videos from sources and so forth. So I had this whole series of videos with Ram Dass and Stephen Levine that we used in our hospice training, because it was all about hospice and end-of-life care stuff. But, he was in a meditation group, but we had it all kind of in the same place. So he was in, what's that? So he was fascinated with all this. I was kind of curious what the draw was. And then at some point they were going to send him back to the prison. I knew he was a medical patient, but he looked pretty healthy. I didn't know what was. He came to me and said, they're sending me back to the federal prison where he'd been. I think it was down in Kentucky or Tennessee. Then he told me he had AIDS. So then about 6 months later, the chaplain came to call me one day to his office and said, Lyle's back, and he's up in this ward, and he wants you to be his hospice volunteer, and I'm going to take you up there and assign him. So he was back, and he was just skin and bones, and he was really suffering with AIDS, and he probably had TB and also something called MA. I can't remember what it's called now. It's been a while. The symptoms can be masked by the meds they're on and so forth. So anyway, you had to wear a mask to go in his room. So chaplain took me in there and closed the door. I'm in a locked room with him, and Lyle got up. He was so frail, but he insisted on sitting up. I kept telling him, no, lay down. He insisted on sitting up to meditate, right? He said, I really kept my practice going, but it's really hard now to practice, and he was in tears. And so I'm sitting there. He wanted to practice. So, okay, we'll practice. So I'm sitting there with him. We're like knee to knee. And, our faces are this far apart, and I've got a mask on. But I know within 10 minutes, the mask is completely useless, right? It's not blocking anything because of, once your breath and so forth gets wet. So, I'm sitting there, and I realize, I'm just sitting here exchanging breaths with somebody that probably has TB and this other thing, and da-da-da-da-da. And it was very interesting confrontation with my own mortality, but I just hung in there because I loved Lyle. And eventually I was kind of waiting for the chaplain to come by because he said he was going to come back by. I finally heard this knock on the door. I was a bit relieved, but then I ended up, being with Lyle every day. And he'd been an IV drug user. We both had. He'd been a smuggler. We both had. He'd been involved in airplane smuggling. We both had. He had a son the same age as mine. He also had a daughter. But so we had so much in common. So as I'm with him, and the biggest pain for him was really his children, similar to my own devastation. And he would share this, and he was amazing. He never got angry with any of the staff. A lot of the patients gave the staff a hard time, would get locked up all the time. There's a lot of anger because they're in a situation where their care was very negligent. They have no options about care. There's no wonder they'd be angry. But he was just, he was very accepting around his whole situation. He was tremendous pain because this is before the protease inhibitors. So he got every opportunistic infection you could imagine. And, anytime he had to defecate, it was extreme pain. He had hemorrhoids and all kinds of skin issues, and he had night sweats and chills, and I'd be packing him in ice or then packing him in blankets, and the pain that he was in was about his children. And he would share that. Well, you could imagine as he's sharing that with me, what's happening for me internally. And it was really profound training because I had to train myself, because the fact that I could identify with his pain is an access point to empathic connection. But at the same time, if I'm getting lost in my own stuff, I'm not there for him. And this isn't about me. This is about him, right? And so, it was really profound training. Of course, I'd had a lot of clinical training background because I'd done that program at European University. But But still, this was real rubber meets the road training on how to really be with someone and be with someone in that environment where there's such deep, profound connectedness of experience, and yet have that be a venue for really being able to hold seat and hold space for someone else in a really empathic, connected way without it being polluted in a sense with your own experience, right? Or conflated with your own experience. That's just an example of one of the profound journeys. I think I worked with about 23, 24 patients over the 11 years that I was actually doing that work in there. I was with about half of them when they died. Many of them would die during the middle of the night, and they didn't used to let us. Towards the end, we managed to get them, if the nursing agreed that person might die that night, they'd let us stay in the unit. And because they're counting you all the time in prison, there's 6 counts a day. And, that means they have to count you in a different unit instead of the unit you're supposed to be in, which creates a whole brain damage for them. And they don't like that. But eventually we got that approved. But a lot of my patients ended up dying when I wasn't able to be there. But I was with about half of them at the moment of their death. And so that was a huge part of my journey there. So it was kind of a combination. Interestingly, wrap this up a little bit here, but I think this is an interesting piece of it. A man named Purna Steinitz, who was a student of a teacher named Lee Lozowick, he contacted me and said they'd run into some of my writings because I was publishing things about my journey in prison in various places like the Shambhala Sun magazine and Tikkun magazine and Yoga Journal and other things. And they'd run into some of my writings and they wanted to use them in this program they had. And so they were telling me about this program, and I kind of recognized something about his connection to it because I was already aware of this program called the Prison Library Project. And the Prison Library Project was a source out of that community, out of Lee Lozowick's community. And I actually had run into it early on in prison, and I had written to them, and, they would send you books. And I said, they said, what are you interested in? I said, well, I'm interested in psychology and Buddhism. So they sent me books on psychology, Buddhism, and they threw in a couple of Lee's books. And I found Lee's books really fascinating. And there was something resonant, completely different tradition, but something resonant to my teacher, Trump Perpetrator. They're both in this kind of crazy wisdom vein. So anyway, then I get contacted about, that's that same community, yeah. And he was doing a program outside his community with permission from his teacher, but a completely secular program called The Event, which was this really deep transformational group work. He had inherited from a guy that developed it in prison. It was called The Game, and it was developed at Marion Prison, the maximum security federal prison that replaced Alcatraz. And a psychiatrist named Martin Groter and an inmate named Kenny Wines developed this therapeutic community there in this Maull called Asclepian Therapy and something called The Game, which had some roots in Synanon and other things. And some people kind of reference it as attack therapy in a pejorative way, but it can be very confrontational. Doesn't have to be, but it can be. And by the time I was introduced to it, Purna had deepened it and was delivering it in a much more conscious, compassionate way. But it was still very, very intense work. It takes people deep into their family awards and stuff very quickly, and then helps them shift their relationship to it, right? Very, very powerful work. So I became fascinated, and he had these follow-up programs, and he wanted to use my writings in the follow-up program. So I became fascinated about this, and I wanted to get it into the prison. And so I got a couple of the prison psychologists interested in it and got them to go do an event outside the prison, because it so happened they were going to do one in the city where the prison was located, Springfield, Missouri. So they did it and loved it, and we managed to get into the prison. If the prison officials had known what it is, I don't think they ever would have let it in. But we got it in. There was a very isolated room on a third floor of this one building. The only building that had a third floor. It was kind of isolated. It's where we did our 12-step groups. So we did it up there because there was a lot of screaming and yelling. There was stick work, and the psychologist smuggled the stick into the prison. And it was physical. There were holdings. It was on the edge of violent, right? It was on the edge of physically violent. So you have 30 men in the room with trainers, and these are tough characters, right? And every ethnicity and every kind of crime, doing this really deep work of taking people deep in it. And it was amazing. We did 4 of them while I was there, and the work continued after I got out. But each time I would say 85% of the men in the room had experienced profound childhood abuse, sexual, emotional, or physical, or all the above, right? And they probably never shared it with anybody. And here they're holding each other in their arms, going deep through this stuff, and, going into rage and going into grief. And it was mostly rage work and grief work and physical holdings and stick work to access that, right? and really group confrontive work and very intense work. And then we developed a follow-up program there for it, which I ran with the psychologist. So that was another deep part of the journey. But the point of this story is when we were enrolling people for the first event inside a prison, I recruited all the men to it. So I was recruiting men from the meditation group, from the hospice work, from the 12-step work. Early on, when I first started leading a meditation group, I saw that people, came and went. If it was nice weather, they'd rather be out playing softball or whatever, and I remember having these judgmental thoughts. Okay, this is going to be tough work. My fellow prisoners are a little on the flaky side, and I recognize that obviously is not helpful judgmental thinking. And so, well, there's got to be, how am I presenting it? How can I present these things, right? And eventually I had the opportunity to bring someone in that was using Vipassana in conjunction with 12-step work. And so I got some people from the 12-step work involved in the meditation group. So now I had myself and them, kind of this participatory qualitative research that I was doing, experiential research on myself and them, with a group of people that were doing meditation and 12-step work. And then when we started the hospice program, I recruited from those groups into the hospice work, right? So then I had a group of us that were doing meditation, we're doing the 12-step work, and we're doing the hospice volunteer service. And then finally, the event, we recruit. So now I've got this group of men, not exclusively so, but a core group of men who are training in meditation. They're doing the hospice service. They're doing 12-step recovery work. And now they're doing this intense group work. And we built this men's work follow-up group around the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover work and some of that kind of work and archetypal Jungian work. And so what this led me to see that transformation requires, there's no magic bullet. There's no one thing that's going to work for everyone or work for anyone, really. It's stacking things till you reach a tipping point for any particular individual. And so by the time I saw these men who are doing all this type of work, and now they're in this intense group work, these were really transformed human beings, and they were transforming others. And they were going to other prisons and starting programs. And the warden became so amazed by the work that was going on. He hired Perna, who was the guy that brought the program into the event, hired him as his executive coach. And then they ended up doing training work with all the executive staff, all the medical staff, all the psychology staff. And then Perna got invited to go on to other federal prisons and so forth. So I learned a lot about the process of transformation in there, and it's really informed my work ever since.
So the game sounds so deep and powerful.
It's amazing work, and I was very fortunate. I did 4 of them while I was in prison, was helping lead the 12-week follow-up program to it. And then when I got out, I became an event trainer, led a couple of years up until the pandemic. We couldn't really shift it online. It's not, we could do online. And Purna's retired now. And the one event trainer that there's a wonderful woman named Condrell Kelly, then we still aspire to perhaps lead events again, but she's going through some medical stuff right now. So it remains to be seen whether we'll be able to do that. It's a very intense program, and they never managed to train a lot of event trainers. There've been a few over the years. You have to be a very kind of special person. You have to have a pretty deep life context to do that work. It's a very trainer-driven process. You're taking people very deep, very quickly. You have to be able to really flow in a place of not knowing and be really sensitive and empathic and on your game. Perna, before I, got involved with him, one time he was doing like 20 events a year. I don't know how he did it because it's exhausting. I was leading it once or twice a year. And we'd be scheduling another one. God, this is crazy, because it's really a completely, it's almost another planet when you're in the event, right? And you really have to be on your game. And so it takes a little while to get warmed up, but you got to get warmed up really quickly because you got to show up for people. So probably the most skillful I've ever been able to be with human beings has probably been in the event at various times. It's deep, powerful work. It was somewhat, I wouldn't say underground, but it was mostly marketed, if you will, just through word of mouth and so forth. Because a lot of people would probably have accused us of bordering on the edge of re-traumatization or other things like that. It's not about very popular kind of work these days. There are still some people that are doing some work around various types of psychodrama and different kinds of group work, but in general, but it works. The one thing that kept me coming back to that work is I would literally see, because so much of people come, people self-select to come into that, And the people coming into the event, I mean, every time the amount of childhood abuse that I had to witness and hold, it was just off the charts. I would have to deal with my own anger sometimes coming out of the event around, what parents had visited on children, especially the sexual abuse. And I would literally see that link break and know that this person is not going to pass this trauma on to their children or to whoever else they influence. I would literally see, because we all know how generational trauma works. We know a lot more about that now through epigenetics and other things. And I would literally get to see that link break. And every time I finished leading the event, no matter how kind of crazy the work was, I said, it's worth it because, I don't do any other work. I do a lot of healing work and lots of stuff, but another where I literally see the chain link break. So I was always very gratified to do that. And when I get 6 months away from it, think about doing another one, I'd go, oh my God, we're really going to do this? Well, anyway, it was a very powerful part of my journey. Yeah.
Well, as a Midwest guy, where did you grow up?
St. Louis. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm from Minnesota. So as a Midwest guy, when I first came out to California, I got into contemplative practices in my kind of early 20s. And I was deep in, kind of contemplative practice up in the far north of California, up in the hills at this place called Heartwood Institute.
Yeah.
And as a Midwest guy, you're familiar with Heartwood.
The name, I've never been there, but I'm aware of all the retreat centers. It's been my world forever. So
Paul Pitchford lived there, healing with whole foods and all that. So I lived there for a few years. And then, the Midwestern spirit, though, can get frozen over and the expressive apparatus get all gummed up. And so for me, contemplation and contemplative practices was key. However, it was not until I ran into expressive practice, getting into deep expression and doing psychodramatic stuff, my work with the Mankind Project, that really got me to cough out the fur ball. You know what I mean? So it's like I really like this approach of contemplation and expression, because contemplation wasn't enough for me. I needed to express. I needed to find a way to let the intensities move through me. And it was, the psychodramatic work in the Mankind Project, which has an edge that when you're talking about this stuff, I'm reminded of my early days in the Mankind Project where we were doing this intense work. And I could feel it when somebody broke that link in the chain,
Well, you've done the New Warriors training. And so there's this one piece of it, the carpet work, or it's called different things. You're familiar with that work. It takes place for, one section of that weekend. Well, in the event, we do that for 3 solid days, 14 hours a day. Exactly that work. It's very intense.
It changed everything for me where, I was just going to, I was going to take my vows and live the contemplative life. And then, I was a craniosacral teacher for many years, still use craniosacral work clinically in my own trauma resolution work. And then with that model, which is very much a contemplative model, craniosacral work, where you just, it's basically like paired meditation, right? And you just sit and you meditate and you listen and you maintain neutrality. But I was starting to see, kind of like the shadows or the limitations of the model because of my own history, that people were just stuck in their ability to express and let the wisdom of emotion move through them. Their body was stuck. So we could sit in contemplation until we were blue in the face or something like that. And at the end of the day, there's a particular percentage of clients that really needed to focus on the expressive pole.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think Vajrayana, at least from a theory and liturgy perspective, kind of embraces that continuum.
Much more so, yeah. It doesn't involve so much the expressive kind of psychodrama, so that kind of stuff, but it very much is embracing those energies and the intensity. It's very about opening up all the emotional channels and working with that. It's working usually in a more kind of individual contemplative way with all of that and in relationship to a teacher. And, there is the Bhakti Sangha and collective work, but it's very dissimilar from that kind of expressive emotional work and psychodrama and so forth. But nonetheless, it's working deeply with emotional energies and in a very fearless way. Absolutely.
I just think it's so important, in the somatics field writ large. I think there's a bit of a pendulum swing from the kind of like the encounter era, where things were intense and these kind of like all night long gestalt marathons and things like that, where now we see, and I think there's some good science to back it up, but also it feels like the pendulum shift to this kind of realm of just taking things really, really slow, which is good practice, mindfulness, which is good practice, but there can almost be an obsession with the slow pacing and a kind of formation, a reaction formation against the intensity. And once intensity starts to ramp up, kind of like a thwarting of it through the prioritization of slowing down.
Yeah, it's not just slowing down. It is a slowing down, but it's also, I think there's been a mindset of fragility and approaching trauma, really not seeing people's resilience and a focus, a bit of a perpetuating kind of a victim mindset around trauma. It's kind of the shadow side of the trauma work. I mean, the enlightenment around trauma that's happened in the last couple of decades, and especially last decade, incredibly important. Our trauma awareness, and we have much more awareness around, much more appreciation for it. And at the same time, like anything, the pendulum tends to go too far one way. And so it's like trauma's everywhere. Everybody's deeply traumatized. And we're going to walk around eggshells on each other and treat each other as super fragile beings, right? And it's not to say that people don't experience fragility, but people have tremendous resilience as well. And so I think, that's one reason I got interested in the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy work, because I think the whole field of psychology and psychotherapy really went way in the direction of seeing people as fragile and really pathologizing people and patientizing people, and a real fear around any of the early Gestalt work and other encounter work and intense psychodrama work. And I'm not saying that there weren't any shadows to that as well. Some people didn't make mistakes. The whole idea of safety. I mean, safety became the primary paradigm. And in a absolutely safe environment, well, it depends on what you mean by safety. A foundation of genuine, empathic, wisdom-based safety is really necessary to deep work. And even in the intensity of the event, we would create that kind of safety. It was absolutely essential. But the more superficial, surface-level safety that I think has come to dominate the world of psychotherapy and spiritual work is a complete preventative to transformation. And it really influenced the Dharma as well, Western Dharma traditions. Many of the prominent Dharma teachers are also psychotherapists. And, I think the Dharma brought a lot of benefit to the world of psychotherapy. I mean, mindfulness kind of took psychotherapy by storm, the same way that psychedelics are now doing. I'm not sure how much psychotherapy helped the Dharma. I think to a degree around ethical standards for teachers and things like that. But it also this thing on really treating people as fragile and say, I mean, I don't want to be too black and white about it, because there are some benefits, and coming from a place of deep compassion and loving kindness and metta and all that. But if your primary thing is not to ever push anybody's buttons, then, you may help them feel comfortable, but you're not really going to lead them in any kind of deep transformational change, right? So anyway, I think all that's been going on. And one thing that's interested me again about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is it's really brave work. It's really fearless work. I mean, they're taking people in these clinical trials into really deep experiences, and psychotherapists are sitting with people and taking them, into stuff that they wouldn't gone anywhere near in psychotherapy. They've been afraid to take people there in psychotherapy for decades now. And now with the use of the psychedelic medicines, they're taking people into these deep, 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 deep places and accessing this stuff. So I think that's why some of the psychotherapists who are really interested in the work, but have not been, because of the cultural zeitgeist, have not been willing to go there in psychotherapy, or felt even, at risk legally to work with patients in this more fearless way. They kind of have permission to do that in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And I think they're very attracted to the work, because now there's something going on again. This is deep. There's something incredible going on, right? So I think there's a renewal of courage coming back into the world of psychotherapy through psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And it's all about the journey. So it may be that we needed several decades of softening and the focus on these kind of things. And now we have a foundation where we can safely get a little more fearless and courageous again in terms of how we work with people. But
Yeah, overcorrection seems to be a part of growth.
it seems to be always the way it is, yeah, individually and collectively, yeah.
Yeah. And I like to say that too much safety is unsafe, because there's a risk taker in the human. There's something oriented towards the edge. There's rage circuits. Rage is in the motherboard of the midbrain. It's just there. And if it's just going to be contemplating, slowing down, that means that we're jettisoning a piece of the motherboard. And it's like, okay, then we're encountering the question of rage. There's rage in the human. What do we do with it? Is there a way to channel it into creativity? Is there wisdom in it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we pay such a huge cost for having both our rage and grief bottled up and unprocessed and not dealt with. I think we pay a huge cost for that individually and collectively. I mean, just everything we see coming out in the culture now, that's all unprocessed rage, right? Today we see it as internalized shame and trauma, and we have a social justice viewpoint around it. But psychologically, it's bottled up and unprocessed rage, and it will always come out as violence until we kind of prevent so much more of the trauma that is visited upon children and on people through wars and forced migrations and all the kind of abuse that happens in childhood and so forth, and find ways to open up the culture around dealing with this. We're going to continue to have this kind of frozen tundra of unprocessed and sort of bottled up shame and trauma and rage. And it will always come out as more violence and more violence and more trauma producing violence, right? I always wondered when we'd be in the event of how much of this was, how much were we influencing the process or how much of it was just self-selection of people that came to the event. But it was like, here we go again. I mean, it was just almost everybody needed to do rage work. Some people, it was primarily grief work. Often it was rage work first and then grief work. We do a lot of holdings and liftings. There's a whole lot of stuff we do around people's nervous systems. But the majority of people that came in were just sitting on this ocean of rage. And that had to really come out before you could do anything else.
That's what it was for me, to blast out of my Midwestern egg. It was rage process, and I had no idea it was there. I found myself in a teepee with 30 men, and there's something about the environment there. It's not anything that anybody said in particular. It was just the qualitative space of the environment. And then suddenly it was my turn to express and to speak about myself. And then this rage just started pouring out of me. I had no idea it was there. And it just
the wavelength that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was on back in the 70s and 80s. She wrote the book on death and dying and really awakened the conscious living and dying movement, along with Stephen and Andrea Levine, who we mentioned before. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a lot of the work she was doing were rage workshops. And she was facilitating people dealing with what she referenced as their unfinished business, right? And she was working with caregivers. So when caregivers would find themselves at the urge of empathic distress and burnout, she said, that's a sign that you're at the edge of the work you haven't done. This is your unfinished business showing up. And it was always rage and grief work. But she had people, pounding on pills and using stick work and doing a lot of anger and rage work back in that day. Yeah.
And then after that, I was lifted up by these guys and I just started bawling my eyes out.
Yeah.
Just to be held and to be expressing this well of suppressed grief that I also had no idea was there. It was just talk about liberation. Felt like I had, just sloughed off, 2,000 pounds or something like that. Balance of contemplation and expression of self-regulation and letting the big intensities flow through. How does that show up now in your neurosomatic mindfulness work? Tell us a little bit about NSM and how that developed and how you kind of toe the line between contemplation and expression.
Yeah. For me, it's really about embodiment and a very deeply embodied approach to contemplative practices. So my first teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, had a very interesting, his own kind of version of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which is a foundational mindfulness teaching in the Satipatthana Sutra. from the Polycanon. And he had, it's mindfulness of body, mindfulness of feeling, which is not this feeling tone. It's not emotions. It's like pleasant, neutral, unpleasant. And then mindfulness of mind, which includes all the mind states, including emotions, and then mindfulness of phenomena. So, but he had a different version of it. Within that, he made a distinction, especially in mindfulness of body, between what he called psychosomatic body, which is the conceptual body. It's made up of all our thoughts and feelings about the body, our images, our memories. It's literally, and it's a reality. We have this conceptual body. In fact, we mostly live in a conceptual world. Like we're out walking around and we pass a tree. Do we really see that tree, that living entity? Or is the mind just very quickly put in the archetypal form of an oak tree or whatever tree? We're mostly living in a world of concepts, and we don't live in direct experience because the brain is constantly economizing and trying to, distill everything down to a virtual reality that we can manage. And so a lot of what awakening in all those spiritual and conceptual traditions is how do you get out of that conditioned conceptual experience in a direct experience of reality. So he made that distinction between what he called psychosomatic body and then body, right? Even studying and practicing with him all those years, that was directly an influence. But I think my practice still, in retrospect, was still too conceptual, or at least not. It didn't go deep enough in the body, or it could have gone deeper in the body. But then I began to be influenced by other types of body work, and certainly the event, and studying lots of different types of somatic work and body work. And there was a big Europe University. The program I was in was started by Ed Podbell. It was originally called Buddhism and Western Psychology, and then became Contemplative Psychotherapy, the same program. But they also have a whole nother psychology program there called Somatic Therapy, and they big emphasis on somatics. And so studying all that work, and then I was also influenced by a friend and a colleague named Reggie Ray, who had a fact he called meditating with the body was his thing. And I did a lot of retreats with him. Just through my own practice, I really got into focusing on opening up interoceptive awareness, the awareness of the internal landscape of the body, the sensate landscape internally in the body. I really began exploring that ever more deeply. And it really began to radically change my own practice and give me much more access to my being at various levels, somatically, emotionally, as well as cognitively and spiritually. And so that was very interesting to me. And so, I had always been reading as much of the neuroscientific research around mindfulness and meditation as I could. And, got connected to colleagues like Richie Davidson and others at UW. And so continually studying that work. And then I honed in on this interoceptive awareness part and really got very interested in that. So that influenced really going much deeper into this embodiment. And along the way, influences from quantum theory and the ideas of the biofield and even the weak light transmission into mitochondria, the beginning to work with energy, as well, because from my Tibetan Vajrayana tradition, we're working a lot with visualization, and you're working, in that traditional language, the Nirmanakaya, Smuggling, and Dharmakaya levels, which is the Dharmakaya is the complete unmanifest world of potentiality, the pure consciousness out of which manifest reality manifests. In Nirmanakaya is this physical world. Nirmanakaya usually references the enlightened manifestation of that, like a Buddha being actually taking birth in a body, the Nirmanakaya manifestation, but it is the physical manifest world. But in between, there's the Smuggling realm, which is really, sometimes people think of it as kind of archetypal realm, but it's very much energy, light realm. And when you're doing visualization practices, you're working with our capacity to work with light and luminosity and energy. And it's not purely visual light. It's really all the senses. So I was getting very curious about all that, right? So all that began to really deepen my own personal practice, and then working with others and working with students and training people, seeing how it was opening up completely new realms of practice for them. And, I was just constantly experimenting with different things. So experimenting with EFT tapping and experimenting with other non-religious forms of visualization and affirmation work and kind of invoking. And, somebody who has done the intense work a lot, we had that whole conversation about the intensity of work. There's also an immersive quality of work. Part of the event and part of the Mankind Project and other similar trainings to that is the immersion quality. So Tony Robbins has been doing that work all along, and his work, huge crowds, and it doesn't involve that individual they do some pretty psycho-expressive work, but not, that kind of that we do in the event. But still, there's a immersion quality to it, right? And he's very much about going. So, there's some really interesting things from lots of different people's work influencing. And so, just beginning to experiment with all these things and seeing how, in working with students, the main obstacle they had is initially working with the busyness of their discursive cognitive mind and not really figuring out how to work with that in a way that isn't just creating more struggle and more activation, really, right? And mistaken notions about how to work with thought and what thought is and all of that. And it's just really a source of struggle, which never allows them to go deeper. Or if they do somehow stumble into going deeper, then maybe they're accessing emotional work that that their tendencies is to suppress or do this or do that or act out on, and they're not really getting any teachings on how to work with that. And they don't really have a vehicle to work with. Even if they're getting teachings, they haven't developed the internal neurophysiological architecture to hold that work. A lot about deep transformational work across all traditions has a lot to do with creating the vehicle for the work, creating the chamber for the work, right? In which you can go deeper. And you have to actually, through self-mastery and discipline and practice, you have to create that body. You have to create that neurophysiological structure that can then allow you to go deeper, because otherwise going deeper is just going to destabilize you, right? And create all kinds of issues and problems. And people either get destabilized or they go into some kind of spiritual bypassing, or all the ways in which people don't continue the work is because nobody's helping them develop that really coherent neurophysiological structure that supports going deeper and holding more energy. Even when people do intensive retreats, and they're good practitioners, they have, good basic mindfulness awareness technique. They do retreats. You start building up all this energy, especially when you're doing either group or individual retreats over many, many days. You're building up all these energy. In the Vipassana community, sometimes they call it the yogi energy, but you start, and you're literally, you're accessing more energy because we're energetic beings and living in this limitless matrix of energy, right? So you're trying to access and hold more energy. But what you'll find yourself doing immediately after retreat, or sometimes in the midst of retreats, is finding some way to leak it off. And you do really stupid things to leak it off. You just go out and after a retreat, go get drunk, or you sit there and watch mindless stuff on TV or anything to leak it off because you don't know how to hold that energy. You're not used to holding it. So you literally, our spiritual work is creating the vehicles that can allow you to operate at a higher energetic level, and then also go deeper and actually do the work of allowing the trauma to come out and heal itself, to allow your nervous system untangle itself and heal itself. So you need to develop that internal neurophysiological structure in a fairly sophisticated way. And so that's what I've been really fascinated with and drawing upon in my own personal practice and working with students, is how to help them develop that structure to where they can just safely then go deeper and deeper and deeper, and not only allow access and allow stuff to heal itself, allow stuff to come into awareness and not repress it and not act out on it, but, eventually, because there's a kind of emptying process, right? There's an emptying process and an untangling process. And so to have the structure in which to allow that to happen without it destabilizing or without reifying something in it or turning it into, different identity confusions, but just really letting the work flow, and then being able to hold more energy in the process, and then to learn to live from that place. It really requires developing a spiritual body, literally a spiritual body that can hold that work, right? And so that's kind of what NSM is all about, is helping people develop, if you will, a spiritual body, a quantum body that can be the vehicle for that ever deepening work. And, I think we know, enough about, from both East and West, that we are energetic spiritual entities having a human embodied experience, rather than that, this idea that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the body, which materialistic science would still hold to, that the deepest realities out of which the world of form and out of which we arise are free of any kind, certainly of any trauma, but they're free of mistakes. There's a certain purity and wholeness. And as you go further and further into form and manifestation, then you get the problems of mistakes and broken circuits and, problems and this and that and that and that. So really part of what the healing process, this is maybe a little bit metaphorical, or at some point we could see it almost literally, is, imagine if we had like an umbilical cord somewhere still, right? And we could just plug back into the quantum field out of which the material world arises to begin with, and we'd plug back in and it would be complete. We'd stay plugged in overnight. There'd be this whole defragmentation process, which actually sleep does on some degree anyway. But we can learn through these contemplative practices in this deeply embodied way to, over time, learn how to drop into these deep, 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 deep states of flow in which literally we're regaining access to that kind of quantum level of reality, which then defragments everything and allows everything to heal, right? But then we have to be able to hold that, because we have to come back and live in this world where we're, just a continual confrontation with disconnection and fragmentation and extremes of stress and uncertainty and chaos and all the stuff that's in the world and in our relationships. So we have to develop a body that can hold, no matter how much healing we do, we have to develop a strong, resilient spiritual body and neurophysiological architecture that can not only keep going deeper with the work, but also relate from that place with the world around us in a sane way, right? So that's really what the NSM work's all about. And as we were mentioning, before we went live here, I've zeroed in with influences from a number of people. I love Dawson Church's work, and he does a lot of this integration and stacking work from different modalities, and other colleagues. I begin focusing on how we can identify particular neural networks that are very much involved in healing and personal evolution and self-mastery. And I have particular practices that target those and strengthen those, which literally means we're reshaping our neural architecture. It means these neural networks are becoming, instead of being faint little pathways like, in a public area in a park, when people start cutting the corner and across and, because there's a shortcut across the grass, you see this little undefined path. And maybe at some point the city gives up and says, okay, let's pave it because that's where people are going anyway. So you got a robust, well-lit pathway, right? So the same way these neural networks in the brain, as we continue cultivating particular states, we're deepening these particular pathways, which means there's literally more neural connections, more dendrites. In some cases, there's neurogenesis and more neurons. And we're developing these robust pathways that allow us to relax further. Meditation practice and deepening in contemplative meditation practices, relaxation is absolutely the key. And it's really difficult to understand what relaxation really means for most of us. But as we develop this internal architecture, that's what allows us to relax more and more. We move from effortful practice, because any practice begins with intention and effort, right? We have to kind of begin to work with our mind, and we work with attention switching. The mind's going all over the place. So we start kind of roping it in. And like Suzuki Roshi said, first give it a great big pasture, but with boundaries, right? So the boundary is your posture. You're going to sit for 30 minutes, whatever it is. And when you notice your mind is wandered, you're going to gently bring it back, not aggressively, but you're very gently, self-compassionate, bring it back without judgment. So, you're gradually kind of slowly training the mind in the way you would train anything, in the way you skillfully train an animal or a human being, or you train yourself. You do it with gentleness and self-compassion, but with clarity, and you're gradually training the mind. So you're strengthening the attention network, right? That network in your brain is becoming more robust. And over time, you find that you have more stabilized attention, greater capacity to focus, concentration, and so forth. So we can do the same with our self-regulation network, which allows us to regulate the autonomic nervous system with the upregulating sympathetic branch, the downregulating parasympathetic branch. So instead of being bounced all over the place by life all the time, we find ourselves, no, we're a lot more balanced. We have our window of tolerance, to use Dan Siegel's expression, is we're amplifying that because we can handle a much larger bandwidth of life's challenges in a very responsive mode. Instead of getting triggered back into fear and survival mode and reactivity, we're still on the balls of our feet in responsive relational mode, and we're able to work with it, even really challenging things, because we've built the architecture for self-regulation and with intentional practices. But the more we do that, we start to do it naturally. We find ourselves naturally doing the breath work of self-regulation just spontaneously because we've built a neural architecture for it. And then that leads into, if we're doing emotional work and we open up to the emotional energy from a place of attention training and self-regulation training, then we'll naturally begin strengthening the emotion regulation network, and we'll be able to open up to experience a very rich emotional life, but in a balanced way. So we're not getting hijacked by either positive or negative emotions. We're not getting undermined by them. We're not going into reactivity, but instead we're really in the flow. We're in that emotional flow. We're able to ride the emotional waves and experience that depth of our human experience and grok all the wisdom within that in a balanced way. And so these are neural networks that are strengthening over time. And then really importantly, and as I've mentioned before, one of the keys to neurosomatic mindfulness, this deeply embodied approach, is by yoking our attention with the body, like really developing this deeply felt, when I begin with students and I talk to them about feeling, right? Feeling sensation. A lot of them, they don't know what I'm talking about. They don't feel their bodies. I have a friend that says in Western culture, the body's been relegated to the role of being nothing but a brain taxi, something to carry around the supercomputer that's on the shoulders, right? It's amazing how disembodied we become. And some people come into my programs and trainings, and I'm trying to guide them into some kind of interoceptive awareness. They have no idea what I'm talking about. They literally don't feel their bodies unless they go, oh, yeah, I can feel that. But they don't feel anything internally unless there's pain, right? And that's for most of us. I mean, we're all aware of interoceptive awareness. If we've even never heard the word, it's just a fancy word for internal perception, but interoception is internal perception. But we're aware of it when we have a headache or when we're hungry or tired and when we need to go to the restroom. That's how we have that. But absent any kind of discomfort, we generally stay up on our heads. We're very visually and auditorially oriented, and busy cognitive experience going on, very externally oriented. So, and we do that to our own detriment, right? Because if we're disembodied, we're completely exposed to all the distractive and traumatizing influences of the world. And we're just like here because we have no foundation. We have no home. And, we literally have no home because we've left our bodies. And now we're trying to live in a virtual world or live on our phones or in social media, right? Because we have no home. And when you have but we need homes. As human beings, we deeply need home. And when we don't have a home, we go looking for home in all the wrong places, right? And that takes us down all kinds of gnarly roads looking for home in all the wrong places, right? So this is all about reestablishing that home. And as we develop that internal neural architecture, that allows us to move from the effortful directive practice that requires us to begin that process to then being able to let go into a more non-dual kind of practice and a more effortless practice. When we move from intentional, effortful mindfulness and awareness into effortless mindfulness and awareness, and attention stabilization develops momentum, and we don't have to work to have it, and it's deepening, and that's the portal into deeper states of awareness. And so we're able to relax further, and relaxing further then opens us into further layers of effortless beingness, and we start dropping into deep states of flow, which requires, because even people who practice a lot, they're often blocked from the deeper states of flow because they can't relax. They can't relax enough to go there because they haven't really built that internal neural architecture. They've learned attention. They can work with attention switching. They know how to practice, but they haven't really done the emotional clearing work, and they haven't developed that internal neurophysiological architecture. So they can't relax to go into that next level. And that's why so many people who are even regular meditation practitioners, I've heard this countless times, and I even said this myself early on in my practice years, I do these retreats and I practice and I have all these powerful experiences, and I go back to my life and I'm as crazy and neurotic as I've ever been, right? And it's not penetrating. Well, it's not penetrating because it's blocked at a certain level, because we can't relax. We can't let go into those deeper states. And the reason is because we're doing our practice, but it's still very effortful. Even though we're trying to practice right effort, it's still essentially very effortful and requires a constant monitoring. It's a cognitively monitoring driven practice, which is where we all begin, but it's got to be internalized so that it can become organic, and we develop the structure for it, and then we can really relax into complete, going beyond all identities and into deep non-dual practice where we have the direct experience that the whole notion that there needs to be a me having this experience is just another thought that arises. We clearly see that the whole construct of my self-narrative and my whole life narrative and me and my, that we see the whole thing as just a conglomeration of thoughts. That could be a little unsettling initially, but eventually becomes profoundly liberating. We know from quantum science that all of reality at the quantum level, is showing up as either particle or waves, depending on, how it's observed and when it's observed and so forth. Well, what would you rather be, a particle or a wave? If you're an individual particle and, this vast world out there with all these other particles, a lot of them bigger and stronger looking than we are, right? But what if we're part of the wave? The more we relax into that and we find our home, we're coming home to the deep level, the pure consciousness that we all are part of, and from that place, of course, that changes everything about how we relate with others, because we realize that we're interconnected with everything, that it's the same pure consciousness looking out my eyes and having this experience is looking out your eyes and having this experience. We're pure consciousness having an exchange with each other right now. Or it's having an exchange with itself through us, right? That seems very conceptual, and you can read that in books, and you may get some little cognitive enlightenments from reading it. It may grok it and think, but when you start really experiencing this in the body and developing the neural architecture that gives you access to living from that place, that radically changes everything.
One of my passions, insofar as somatic research goes, embodied research, and my own journey with meaning is this quality of the tingle response, the goosebump response. Because what I find is that in holy moments of my life, moments of deep meaning, moments of people unlocking and finding freedom in their body and their mind, and moments of group cohesion where creativity is just in that flow state, I often get this wave of tingles, goosebumps going up and down my spine. Do you find that to be the case for yourself? I mean, you've had a lot of deep experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. In traditional advanced non-dual practices in the Vedic traditions and Tibetan tradition and others, a really key instruction is about not attaching to anything, because that becomes a bluff. Then
Go chase the tingles, bro.
So, you could have the tingling experience, and then that becomes a marker. Oh, where's the tingling? I'm not tingling now. You can keep that productive. So that's one of the danger with these things that arise. There's another thing that can arise in your visual field if you're doing eyes open practice, which is this little shimmering sparkles of sort of lights popping through the visual field, right? It's called fireflies. And
the face dancing when you're in a deep moment with somebody and their face just starts to morph into different faces and you're like, whoa, what's happening?
So when people have those experiences, then they tend to, want to recreate or get attached to those experiences. So it's very, one of the things in advanced practice is that you have a constant state of inquiry about, in advanced formless practices, noticing subtle, even, initially very gross levels, but then subtle and subtler levels of any kind of clinging or attachment or any kind of fabrication that you're still trying to create something. You're trying to create some state or something, right? But, along the way, you do have all these experiences. And actually yesterday I was at a online group with some of my students. And Neurosomatic Mindfulness, we very intentionally work with trying to develop awareness of our skeletal structure. The entire body is a living organism, all containing neuronal cells connected to the central nervous system, and including the outer white hard layer of the bones, the periosteum. Even the marrow of the bones has neuronal cells. So all the organs, all the lymphatic system, the endocrine system, the musculature, the connective tissue, it's all organic, it's all living, it's all contains neuronal cells. So it's all feeling, it's all sensory. And so we can feel into it. And so we intentionally do practice where we're working with the skeletal structure, where we're working with the musculature, connective tissue, where we're working with various internal organs. So she was sharing yesterday of how in really working with the organs, she had an experience about 10 days ago where just suddenly she gained access. And it was in particular, I think it was her thyroid, and she has hypothyroid, I think. So her thyroid, I think it was maybe her kidneys, and also it might have just been the biome in general or something, but there were 3 particular areas of the body, and she was connecting to different emotional energies in these, and really kind of traumatic energies and forms. And it was almost like she was in direct communication with these organs, and she was getting this transmission of the actual kind of trapped energy there and the trauma of that. And in the experience of it was also combined with this tingling quality of being in that deep communication with the body. Most of my practice and my practice life and tradition has been eyes open practice. But in doing the embodiment work, I encourage people to practice with their eyes closed to begin with. It really helps access the internal landscape. And when we're practicing, and as we begin to experience, the deeper we go, the more our attention stabilizes, and the more we can relax, and the more we're accessing this internal neurobiofeedback loop that's allowing us to move in a more effortless practice. And we're starting to drop into flow. It's like a shimmering, it can be a tingling, it can be physical tingling, but shimmering awareness. It's a quality of light. And in some of the traditionals, they'll talk about luminosity, and people usually just think that's visual. But it's not just visual, it's all the senses. What the deep yogic traditions have found about the nature of mind is that it's empty of any kind of independent self-structure, anything you could identify as individuality or self. It's limitless and unobstructed. And its nature is clarity, luminosity, knowing there's consciousness, right? There is this, it may not be I'm conscious of, but there's consciousness. So there's this quality of luminosity, and it can be visual light luminosity, and we are light beings. Photons are one of the most essential, basic kind of quantum level structures of the material world and of our bodies, but it's all the senses really. But there's this, it can be related to the tingling experience, but it can happen without the tingling experience. But there's this kind of shimmering luminosity, awake energy that pervades all the senses.
Now, shimmering luminosity, I love that. Especially coming from a man that, was really forged in the crucible of a prison. So you're uniquely suited and you have a unique credential to aid people in liberating themselves from their own prisons and finding that shimmering luminosity. So really just honor you and respect your path and what you've done to get here. And thank you so much for coming on the show. Is there anything that you'd like to pitch in terms of your work, your summits, your great summit work out in the world? You have an anxiety summit coming up soon. Anything you want to throw down here?
I don't know when this episode's going to go live, but as you and I are recording this, we're in February, and we're just wrapping up our Relationship Wisdom Summit, which is an amazing summit. And we have a rather inexpensive all-access membership program where people get access to all of our summits if they get interested, and they can access that at heartmind.co. So we have that all-access membership program and community. There's probably almost 1,000 hours of transformational content there now, and we're building curated journeys within it, so it's not just an overwhelming experience. And there's a whole community platform within it for people to engage and connect with each other. Next month, we have our Art of Meditation Summit, where we have 65 of the most renowned meditation teachers in the world across 8 traditions: Zen, Vipassana, and Tibetan Buddhism, 3 Buddhist traditions, the Vedic traditions, secular non-dual, the Abrahamic traditions with Christian, Sufi, and Jewish meditation, as well as New Thought with Michael Beckwith. And then we have the mainstream mindfulness movement, a day on that with John Kabat-Zinn and people like that, Christian Neff. Then we have a day on neuroscience-informed approaches in a neuroscience with people like Richie Davidson and Rick Hansen and Judd Brewer and people like that. But, we have really the most prominent Deepak Chopras in the summit, 4 Tibetan Rinpoche, Mingyur Rinpoche, Punlap Rinpoche, Sokden Rinpoche, Dzigar Khantrul Rinpoche in the Tibetan day. Robert Thurman is in it. Really amazing Zen teachers and Vipassana teachers, Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg and many, many other prominent Vipassana teachers. So that's happening next month in March. And then in April, we have an Entrepreneurial Mastery Summit. Really, it's all about how to succeed in business and succeed at life. So how can you be really successful as an entrepreneur without, ending up in divorce and your kids being in therapy and ruining your health, right? That you can actually do both. And we have this amazing group of some of the most successful entrepreneurs and teachers of entrepreneurship and just amazing minds as April. And then as you referenced, in May, we're having a summit called Rewiring Fear and Anxiety World Summit. And we have this series of summits. The first one was Rewiring Your Brain, which was rewiring your brain for health and well-being, for life optimization, for success, for happiness, for improving your relationships, for longevity, for every aspect of our life, that we can literally rewire, reshape our neural architecture to optimize our lives across all of life's dimensions and whatever's important for each of us individually. So now we developed a series. Last November, we did one called Rewiring Your Beliefs, really kind of for the same purpose, but seeing how part of optimizing our lives is changing the belief structure that drives how we show up in the world and perceive the world and react to the world, or respond to the world, ideally. And so this one is Rewiring Fear and Anxiety. And there's so much fear and anxiety in our world today, and we felt it was really important to address that And so we're bringing together some of the top clinicians in the world to bring forth the knowledge and the skills. I think it's really important to know and realize we are biological beings, and job one for any species, any biological alive species, is survival, right? So we have deeply embedded biology of fear and survival. And that pervades how our nervous system is built. We have the exact same nervous system we had back in the days of the caves, right? When our lives were constantly threatened by major predators, right? And so we still, whether we realize it or not, back in the back of our brain, there's this conversation, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to starve to death, there's a saber-toothed tiger at the door. And that hasn't changed, right? And we get triggered constantly by all kinds of stuff into that very same reactivity neurobiologically. But it's even happening at the cellular level. At the cellular level, even at the level of the mitochondria, these organelles that are life force engines in every cell, the predominant prime directive there is to not die, to not be consumed, to not die, to eat, to consume, to not starve to death, and to procreate, to pass the genetic information forward, right? And that's happening even below our level of consciousness, right? So we need to develop a buffering between that level and how we operate our lives such that we're not driven by that. Because if you're a human being and your life is literally driven by fear of dying, by fear of starvation, and by the need to procreate, it gets pretty messy pretty quickly. And we see a lot of that in the world, and we're all driven by that to an extent. Most of us have enough kind of there's enough culture stuck that we're not, completely driven by that. And we have some ethical foundations, and, in the culture, although there are people who get completely out of control with all that and they end up in a prison system, right? But we're all so driven by it. So we need to develop this buffering. Right? And so a lot of this work is how we can do that individually. So individually and collectively, we're actually able to live conscious lives. And to me, that's why we're here as human beings. That's the hero's journey, individually and collectively, is to sort of transcend our fear and survival biology to live conscious lives. And then that biology becomes in service of consciousness, right? Instead of the other way around, right? The whole Rewiring Your series is all about that. And we're going to be doing more summits this year. We'll do another summit around assisted psychotherapy in October. We're going to be doing summits around resilience and how to relate with AI, not in a fear-based way, but see this is just a new tool at our disposal that we can use to optimize our creativity, optimize our business success, optimize our life success, and to try to move beyond the fear relationship to it. Not that we don't need to all take collective ownership for how AI plays out, but it's here, it's a tool, and we can either, this is scary, this is going to ruin the world and ruin me, or we can, like everything else in life, we can embrace it and figure out how can we use it creatively to optimize our own lives. And, it's amazing the possibilities are. So we're going to do a whole summit around that. Yeah, so that's kind of the work we do. If people just want access to all this stuff for a very low subscription rate, they can join our community and then have a community of like-minded folks to engage in all this material with. So you can find out about our Heart Mind All Access community at heartmind.co.
Brilliant. I mean, when you're talking about the evolution, I was reminded of my the Neuroscience of the Archetypes seminar. Mm-hmm. Gosh, maybe that would fit in the anxiety summit.
Yeah, very much well could. And we'd actually love to invite you to be part of that anxiety summit. I think you'd make a great contribution. And I'll just give a shout out for my book. You mentioned it before, but that's Radical Responsibility. But it's how to move beyond blame, fearlessly live your highest purpose, and become an unstoppable force for good. And you can find that at radicalresponsibilitybook.com. You can download a free chapter there.
Unstoppable force for good. Sounds like Dr. Fleet Maull. Well, thank you so much. I feel like we could just keep on going. I just would love to hear more stories about inside life and being in the prison, and just what a rich, deep life you've lived. Many blessings to you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Dr. B. Great to connect with you. Great to connect with your audience. Wish everyone the best.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Boundless Body Podcast. Please like us, share, subscribe, and until next time, stabilize, catalyze, and thrive